Alright, now let's talk about red tea or black tea. What Chinese people call red tea is actually what known in the West as black tea. In China, we have another category of tea that we call black tea that is lesser known in the West, but is getting more and more popular. So you can see the confusion, and that's why sometimes the Chinese black tea in the West, people will call it the dark tea, or just use the Chinese terminology for black tea, which is called Pei Cha. However, for the purpose of this course, we're going to use the Chinese terminology, which is Hong Cha or red tea, to call a category of tea that's very similar to the black tea that's known in the West. All right, so by definition, a red tea is a tea that's fully fermented. So what it means is that we have fully utilized the enzymes that exist in the tea leaves, and we have let it finish its full capability of metabolism. And basically with the enzyme's capability, you can say that it has converted all the compounds in tea to a different set of compounds. And the tea is fully oxidized as well. So that's why the tea usually, not only the dry leaves, but also the liqueur has a very dark color. As you can see, the color is a little bit reddish instead of a blackish color. And when the tea is fresh, it's very astringent. So remember we talked about how a green tea kind of have more of tea's original taste profile, which is bitter and tannic. And you can probably guess, red tea, as it kind of on the other end of the spectrum, it actually deviates the most from this kind of profile. So very well made black tea or red tea is actually very round, naturally sweet, and it's very smooth. It's a very, very drinkable tea, probably quite different from the astringent and tannic black tea that people usually associate with, and the tea that you have to add sugar and milk to. A very well made red tea is actually naturally sweet. The tea I'm using as demonstration today is a Keemun. So Keemun is a better known red tea in the Western world. It's actually named after this township in China called Keemun. Majority of the Keemun in the market don't really come from Keemun. It just bears the name. It's more of in that style. However, this is a tea that actually comes from Keemun. In Chinese, we'll actually just call it a red tea from Keemun. So it's called Keemun Hong Cha, or you can say it's just a Keemun red tea. And when we want to abbreviate that, the short version is called a tea hong. The tea can be further named after its shape. So for this one, it does not have any deliberate shape making other than the required rolling for us to actually make a red tea. So what it is just this tea is actually just called a Hong Mao Feng, because this kind of no shape making is called a Hong Mao Feng. Okay. And immediately when I brew the tea, I can already smell the sweetness in the tea. So even though being a fully fermented tea, red teas are not really known for its aroma, but Keemun is particularly known for its aroma. Even though it's not comparable to a oolong, however, within the red tea category, it's definitely considered probably the most aromatic red tea. And it naturally has a lot of aroma of rose, kind of dry fruit, so it has like a deeper note. Again, we typically do not drink the rinse because it's still very diluted and it'll be rude to serve the guests the rinse. However, you want to drink the rinse if you're testing a tea or you're just first time getting to know a tea, and also you're not afraid of any of your guests judging your hospitality sincerity, you can definitely drink the tea and it'll tell you if the tea had gone through any undesired conditions post the making of the tea. The rinse should taste very, very clean. And for red tea, the rinse is very pleasant because it's just mildly sweet. All right. And when you don't want to finish drinking your rinse, you can give it to your tea pet. This is Choo-Choo. I do love this rinse, so I'm going to have another sip. As you can see, it's naturally sweet. And this sweetness is very different from the sweetness that we have experienced in the green tea, the white tea, and the oolong, where the sweetness seems more abstract. It's almost like it's a feeling of sweetness, or it's aroma that is sweet. This sweetness is more actual, right? It's like you know that this is sweetness on your palate, and that's a big difference between this kind of real sweetness versus the more abstract version of sweetness. Let's do the first brew. Red tea, because it's quite fermented, and you can chew on the spent tea leaves. You want to taste this method, but you probably spit it right out because it's not going to be very pleasant. But given it's fully fermented, the shell of the tea, the membrane of the tea will have hardened, and it'll have almost like a rubber kind of consistency. And this is also why it's able to handle very hot temperature. So for good red tea, you shouldn't be afraid to ruin the tea with boiling water. I'm using 5 grams of tea for this standard size gaiwan, which is about 110 milliliter. And that's the typical standard brewing size for a red tea. Okay. So, within Keemun, there are actually many different little further townships that makes tea, and they do hold different ways. And under the township, there are villages as well. So this one comes from a highly sought after location in the recent years called Shiji, because they have these semi-wild tea trees. And so not only by definition, these tea trees are not planted by this generation, so these are heirloom tea trees, and also the biodiversity is just unbeatable. This is distinctly different from the rows and rows of tea trees that you typically see in a tea plantation. And even though it's very commonly seen in marketing material, however, just keep in mind that if you see rows and rows of tea trees, basically everywhere you look around are nothing but tea trees, that's monoculture, and it's actually really bad for the tea trees. The good tea trees, especially given the tea trees are evergreens, you kind of want it to grow among other trees. So the better tea tree pictures are actually the ones that's kind of hard to tell which ones are tea trees and which ones are not, because they're all green. So the semi-wild tea trees really just kind of grows in a forest, and not only that, it's very good for the environment, sustainable, but also these tea trees, they usually had to kind of try harder in order to survive in such environment. So there are a lot of complexity in the tea as well. They're usually more robust, and if it falls into the hands of excellent tea makers, they're able to bring the best out of these tea. And then so when you have complexity but very well balanced, that such organized profile is what gives you a great tea. And the cultivar for this tea is an heirloom cultivar, but it does have a name for this group of cultivars, and that's called Chuye. So that's the most typical heirloom cultivar for a Keemun. However, a lot of the Keemun that comes from the surrounding plantations does come from a asexual produced cultivar, so it's basically a clone. It has a very Chinese name. It's called Hongqi number 1, so red flag number 1. That's the name of the cultivar. And the teas that made from that cultivar usually is milder, and it has a more delicate taste, but it's not as long lasting actually. Okay, to make red tea, so red tea is a tea that's seemingly easy to make because it has less steps. However, there's no going back to fix a step, so it's actually quite challenging to make a really good red tea. The typical picking grade for red tea is a bud and 1 or 2 tea leaves, so it's quite tender, comparable to green and yellow teas. And then after you pick the tea, you want to let the tea to lose its moisture to the extent that if you roll the tea with your hand, it doesn't break. So while the tea loses moisture, it basically increases elasticity as well. So this is different from the wilting process of oolong and from white tea. And it can typically takes hours to finish. And after that, we take the red tea, the already wilted red tea, to be rolled. And the rolling is also the longest for red tea than in any other categories of teas. During this step, you want the membranes of the tea to be sufficiently broken, and so to maximize exposure to oxygen. And then after that, you want to take the raw tea to put it in a kind of bamboo tray. Depends on the size of the tray. You can pile it at different heights, but usually not too much. People usually try to make a lower center. This way the heat will distribute more evenly. And then we'll put it into an environment that has the optimal moisture and temperature level that we want. The traditional way, you kind of just leave it at the room temperature, and you might use very natural remedies to do that, such as maybe putting, giving a little bit of water on the floor, or putting more giving the putting a charcoal bean in the surrounding environment to increase the temperatures, things like that. Or what you can do is to use a fermentation machine, which is a very commonly used nowadays as well, and it helps to regulate the temperature and the moisture level of the tea. And then after the fermentation usually takes about 4 to 8 or 10 hours, really depends on the condition that you're going through. For a Keemun, it's typically 5 to 7 hours length. And after the tea is fermented, by this point the tea should really smell sweet as well. For Keemun, you can use a method to quickly cook the tea, but when you do this in the wok, you do not want the temperature to be so high that you actually cook the tea. You just want it to give enough heat so there's additional steams that can go out the tea. It brings the tea to a drier state after the fermentation, and it helps to increase the purity of the tea. This step sometimes is skipped, which is fine. It really depends on the environment. Then there are different techniques you can use to manipulate the tea leaves. And after that it is finished, then we spread the tea out onto the tray, and then we bake the tea until it's dry. And usually you want to wait for a few weeks after the tea has been dried, and of course we sort the tea for any impurities such as the yellow leaves and the stems. For red tea picking grade, usually it's less a problem, so it's less sorting that needs to be done, but still needs to be done. And then the fining process comes, and this is a step in Chinese we call tixiang, which means enhanced aroma. This is where you bring the tea to a temperature level that it really enhances the aroma of the tea, and it repels any impurities of the tea, but you do not want this temperature to be so high to the point where roasting the tea. So it's a very tricky step, but when it's done right, that's why you have such very a lot of structure around the profile of a very well made red tea. It also increases the shelf life of the aroma as well, so the aroma of the red tea can be kept for a longer period of time as well. And if this step is not done right, if this step is not done, then the tea will feel like a lack of a level of strength. But if this step is overly done, then you can have a red tea that has a distinctive cacao note or like a chocolate note, which is not good, because by that point it actually homogenizes all the notes and completely forgo everything we care about, such as the location, the terroir, the cultivar, the varietal, these kind of things that we care care about that makes each tea distinctively unique are basically all went for nothing, because now no matter what kind of tea you make to use to make the red tea is all going to taste like chocolate. And then you can also make a cold brew with the red tea. So you can use the same 5 grams of tea, and then you put it into a wine bottle size bottle, which is about 750 milliliter, and you let it brew for 2 nights, about 40 to 48 hours. The tea will be even sweeter than when you brew it hot. They will have a very prominent honey note, and some of the floral note might come through more as well. And also a good red tea usually is very umami, and that umami note will come through even more in a cold brew.